All right, welcome. We are going to continue our series today, and we're going to jump into the book of Revelation, start working our way through that. It's going to be probably the longer, I would think, of all the sections that we do. And so we can kind of just jump right into it. It's called Revelation. I think probably the more proper term is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so it's not just revelation about end times. It's specifically the revelation of Jesus Christ. In fact, some of the original titles carry that. In fact, even in our modern Bibles, it'll put that in there. Mine has it. But I know for sure some of the original, or at least oldest, manuscripts that we have listed as the revelation of Jesus Christ is the full title of the book. The reason that's important is because it's not necessarily trying to show end times teaching, it's primarily trying to show us. So keep in mind the context of when this is written. 20, 30 years after Jesus has ascended to heaven and been at the right hand of the Father. You got all these disciples that, they lived with him for 3.5 years. They've spent their life ministering in his name. They spent their whole childhood learning about the scriptures and awaiting the Messiah, and then they actually got a chance to walk with him. But I'm sure 30 years later, that 2 to 3 year window seemed all too short, probably, and you imagine that they're probably thinking, what is he doing? You would think that they probably had an expectation, like everybody does, that he was going to come back in their lifetime. I bet they weren't thinking that they would live and die and never see him again until they got to heaven. I bet that after having walked with him and him saying, "Oh, I'm going to the Father, but don't worry, I'm coming back," I bet they expected that they were going to see it, many of them, in their lifetime. And so there's probably some underlying, man, what is he doing? So there's probably a little bit of that. And so John gets a revelation, and it's showing, in some respects, what Jesus is doing, particularly some of the first parts, when it sees the throne room, and the Lamb is there, and the Lion is there, and it's kind of like this revelation of Jesus in heaven, right? We kind of take some of that part for granted, that we just kind of know now that he's there, but apart from the book of Revelation, we have some scriptures of it, but we don't have any detailed pictures of it, right? So Paul teaches that we're seated with Christ at the right hand of the Father, but there's nobody in the letters really. Paul says he went there, but he doesn't explain what he saw. He says, I wasn't allowed to speak of some of these things I saw. And so if we didn't have the book of Revelation, all we would know is he's there, right? Revelation kind of almost like gives us a picture of it in some respects and helps us to see a little more. And so a lot of our imagery of Jesus in heaven comes from this book of Revelation, because it is the revelation of Jesus Christ. That also helps us to understand what its purpose is. Its purpose is not just to teach end times. It's not like it's just trying to teach us how everything ends. The main point of the book is to teach us more about who Jesus is, right? Now that he's gone back into his glory. So we'll have that kind of in the back of our mind. I also wanted, if you want to turn in Revelation, we'll start in Revelation 1:1. Many people in the last 100 years teach Revelation from a futurist point of view, meaning they consider that most of it has not happened yet, right? And that it is all things that are still to unfold. In fact, the vast majority of people that teach Revelation will teach it as a picture of a 7-year tribulation, which a lot of the people that teach that, if you remember, we looked in Daniel and he talked about that last 7. And so that would be 7 years in that last 7. And that's kind of where they get that 7-year tribulation, because it's not in the book of Revelation. It doesn't say that there's a 7-year tribulation. In fact, that word 7-year tribulation isn't even in the Bible. In fact, if you remember back to our Matthew chapter 24, Jesus uses the word tribulation, but it's all in connection with the fall of Jerusalem, right? And so, but for whatever reason, many futurist teachers will present this entire book of Revelation as a apocalyptic look at a future 7-year tribulation that is still to come, right? And then, but if you read Revelation 1:1, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, things which must shortly take place, right? So that kind of throws another angle on it too. There's 2 things in that. Number one, on the one hand, you're getting a revelation of Jesus there. The other way to take that phrase is to say that this picture of what's about to happen, I believe to Jerusalem, futures teachers would say it's something for down the road. But the revelation itself this is one way to take that opening verse, that the revelation itself is the revelation given by Jesus. So people take that kind of different ways. Some people take that when it says it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, they're saying it's showing Jesus in the heavenly realm. The other way to take that is they're saying this revelation is coming from Jesus, the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is coming from him. But the interesting part, where I'm really after, is it says that these things must shortly take place. So if you take a futurist point of view, then it would be to teach that when Jesus opens the book and says, hey, I want to show you something that's soon to happen, it had absolutely nothing to do with anyone that was going to read it in the beginning. All these people that he wrote it to would live and die and never see any of this stuff, and it's only thousands of years later, and we still haven't seen any of it happen. And that's what he meant by, I have to show you something that's soon to happen. It really stretches the definition of the word soon to happen, or the phrase soon to happen, verse. If you take this which is how I'm going to present this, is that 80% of the book of Revelation is the unfolding in apocalyptic pictures of Matthew 24. That everything Jesus said that was going to happen leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, John is seeing this in apocalyptic prophetic imagery, but it's the same story in Revelation that we had in Matthew 24. That there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and there's going to be all kinds of terrible things leading up to the destruction of the temple, right? And so if it's that, then when he says, I'm about to show you these things that are soon to happen, then you realize that John is writing, maybe 5 years or less before all of this stuff with the fall of Jerusalem gets going. Then it really kind of brings it together, and you realize what he's doing. He's trying to give them a warning from heaven that they're getting close to the time of what he was prophesying, right? Right before he left. So it's almost like the very last things that Jesus was prophesying is the destruction of Jerusalem. And then when he gets to heaven, right before that happens, he sends John this big vision, as if to say, it's here now. I warned you before I went to heaven. It's been 40 years, and I'm reminding you again, this is about to happen, right? And so that's how I take the book of Revelation. One of our earliest copies of this is called the Syriac New Testament from Syria. It's the land north of Israel there. And it's from the 2nd century, so it's very close, within 100 years or so of the originals here. So it's Definitely one of the earliest copies of the New Testament. It has Revelation in it, but it says its title is longer. It says the revelation of Jesus Christ given to John while he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos under the reign of Emperor Nero. And so, which to me is also, when we get to that section, we'll look at it. But there is one part when he's talking about the beast that's going to come and destroy the great prostitute, and he says that the 5 kings. This is the mystery. He says 5 kings have come. The 6th now is, and the 7th is still to come. So he says the 6th now is, that he is riding in the reign of the 6th king. Well, Nero was the 6th Caesar, right? But it was the 7th Caesar after Nero who was the one who actually came and destroyed the temple, right? And so that further puts everything into this short time frame of not 2,000 years later, but to the people it was written to. This was for them. I mean, we can learn from it, we can see from it, and then there's some parts at the end that I do believe, when it's talking about final judgment and new heaven and new earth, that there are some things at the end that are still to come for us. But the vast majority of this book was a prophetic revelation to the people who are living in the years right before God's judgment is poured out on Jerusalem, right? Which is a big deal. I mean, that was the whole Bible is the history of the Jewish people, pretty much, as God's chosen people carrying this revelation. And he says this is it for them. I'm going to wipe them essentially out. And for 2,000 years they weren't even a nation. And so that, anyways, it was a big deal. And so the reason I talk about that part is that this whole revelation, if he's saying these things that he's seeing are taking place in the reign of the 6th and then the 7th king, and then that Syriac version says that John wrote this in the reign of Nero, who was the 6th Caesar, and the 7th Caesar is the one that comes in and destroys Jerusalem. It really fits with what I showed you in the earlier videos further down in Revelation, where the beast comes from the city on the 7 hills, which is Rome, to destroy the great prostitute, who is the great city, the Bible says, which in the beginning of that section, it says the great city is Jerusalem. So, and you have this prostitute who is the great city, right? And the great prostitute is what Jerusalem was called when he destroyed them during Solomon's reign. And so you have this beast coming from Rome to destroy this prostitute, who, by the way, is also wearing the garments of the high priest with the plate that says blasphemous names, whereas he was supposed to have a plate on his forehead that said holy to God, but she has a plate on her forehead that says blasphemous names. And so you have a picture of this beast from Rome destroying this woman in Jerusalem. And John says all that's going to take place in the 7th king, during the reign of the 7th king. And so it all just really fits nicely together that it was the 7th Caesar that came in and destroyed Jerusalem. And John was writing in the reign of the 6th Caesar. So I just want to be real clear from the beginning where we're headed with our Revelation stuff, so that we can kind of put it all together and see how it all fits. Okay, let's do a few more things here. All right, let's go to chapter 4 of Revelation. The first 3 chapters are him talking to churches and that were functioning in the first century when he's writing this. I don't know if it's true or not, but there is an early church father, let's say 100 years after Paul died, who said that the reason Paul wrote 7 letters to 7 churches of his letters, was because he was trying to model it after the 7 letters in the book of Revelation. So that early church father was trying to say that Paul had access to the book of Revelation before he died and before he started writing some of these letters, which is possible because he does talk about us not being from below, but we are from the heavenly Jerusalem that is above, and that was one of the visions that John had here. So it's definitely possible. But anyways, the reason that I'm not going to go through those verse by verse is because I think those were just genuinely warnings to the church. I don't know that they're end times things for us. Some people try and say, well, what if those are prophetic pictures of different seasons and generations? If they are, I don't know how you'd know it though. You know what I mean? Like it never says that anywhere. It just says that these are churches that were alive then, that had actual problems, that Jesus was writing to them to prepare them, to get them to button up, if you will, before all of this terrible period under Nero was about to really start unfolding, so we'll see. As far as whether those are unfolding prophetically or not, I tend to think that they're not, but that is what some people think. Some people think, well, the first church he writes to is the early church, and each one is a different period all the way till you get to the end. And the trouble is, everyone that's ever thought that has thought then that the Laodicean church, which is the last one, was their generation, and they live and die in the next generation, and said, oh, well, we must be the Laodicean church, and they were the ones that were lukewarm. And I tend to say if they were prophetic of it, I don't know how you would know which one you were, at any given time. And so for that reason, I'm just going to take those as just warnings to real churches when he was writing this. And we'll pick up our study of Revelation in Revelation chapter 4, where John starts to get this revelation from the heavenly realms, right? Okay. Those first 3 chapters were just very specific letters to the churches. I think there's a lot of good teaching from those. Like if you were wanting some good teaching on how to live your life, what it means to be a conqueror, because in each one he gives examples of being an overcomer, being a conqueror. And so I think there's excellent teaching from that. I just don't think they have anything to do with much with the end times. Right? Okay, so Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, right? Says, after these things I looked, and behold, a door was standing open in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place after this. All right, so this is where futurist teachers, they jump on this one. They're teaching, futurist is teaching that from Revelation chapter 4 on, that none of this has happened yet. And so most of them will take this verse as being the rapture. And so when he says, I heard a voice like a trumpet saying, come up to be with me, they take that to be a picture of the rapture, where Paul says at the last trumpet. And but there's nothing in here at all that mentions anything about the church or anything like that. The only one who's coming up is John, who is being called up to heaven to receive this vision. And so I think that's kind of very misleading to make that as if that's saying, oh, that's when the church goes up and everything else happens. I think all he's saying is John is being called up to heaven, and he's in heaven for the next whole major section of this, where he's seeing the seals being opened, and he sees the throne room and all of that, the 7 seals, and then the 7 trumpets, all of that he's seeing because he has been taken to heaven for this vision. I don't think it's talking at all about the church being taken to heaven. It's just explaining how John got up to the throne room of heaven to be seeing this vision, right? And so when he gets there, verse 2, he says, immediately I was in the Spirit, right? So again, he's talking about himself in this part, not the church 2,000 years later. It says, immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardis stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. So it says a rainbow like an emerald. So a lot of these descriptions, you gotta kind of just use your imagination, I guess. But like what I envision there, it almost seems like we'd say it's the shape of a rainbow, but an emerald is green. It's only one color. So I don't know if he's saying it's the rainbow around him is various shades of green. And it says around the throne were 24 thrones. And on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. So he says basically a throne for the Lord is brought out. And then around that are 24 smaller thrones for the elders. Now, who the elders are is hard to know. Some people think that, when it talks about the New Jerusalem, I think it says that the 12 of the apostles' names, I think, are on the foundation, and 12 of the 12 tribes are the gates, or I might have had that backwards, but the New Jerusalem has the 12 tribe names and the 12 names of the apostles. So some people think that's the 24. And then also keep in mind, this could be just a vision, you know what I mean? It may not be, sometimes God shows people things in a vision, but it's not necessarily happening. They're receiving a vision. And the reason I say that is because if 12 of the 24 elders are apostles, then it can't actually be happening, because then John would be one of the 24 elders, you know what I mean? And the other apostles are still alive, most of them, when he's writing this, so they wouldn't be in heaven. So either the 24 elders are someone other than the apostles, or this is just a vision where the things he's seeing are all filled with symbolic meaning. I'll give you an example of that. So he talks about in verse 6, it says, before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature was like a calf, the third living creature had a face of a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. Right? So there's 2 things here. Possibilities. This could just be 4 angels that are unique, right? These 4 living creatures, or they could be symbolic. For sure, there is a connection between this and the Exodus wanderings. So when he had them set up camp, they would God's throne, the Ark of the Covenant, was right in the middle, right? And then around that, you had, the camp was broken up into 4 groups. It's like these 4 living creatures. So you got 3 tribes on the east, 3 tribes on the west, 3 tribes on the north, 3 tribes on the south. So the 12 tribes broke up into 4 groups around the throne. So you got here in Revelation, you got the throne and 4 living creatures around the throne. And then each of the groups of 3 on each side, out of those, 1 tribe was chosen to be the lead tribe. So whenever the Ark of the Covenant was packed up and they had to leave, and everyone was going to go and follow, and they had to set up camp and break, and then they would go to wherever the next place was that they were going to camp. 1 tribe from each, north, south, east, and west, 1 from each group of 3, was designated the lead tribe. And so what they would do is they would lift up their standard, their banner, right? And each tribe had a banner, a flag, if you will, that represented their tribe. And in general, they all took their inspiration for their tribe's flag from the blessing that Jacob pronounced on each tribe at the end of Genesis. So Genesis 48, 49, 50. That's the end of Jacob's life, and he starts blessing everyone, and he sends out a blessing on each tribe. And so, for example, that's where we get the lion of the tribe of Judah is from the prophecy that Jacob speaks over the tribe of Judah. And so Judah was a lead tribe. So they would lift up their standard, their flag, and you would have the lion on it. And then when they would march out, then all of Judah would march behind the flag, and then the other two tribes in their grouping of three would follow behind them. So Judah's standard was the lion. On another side, you have Ephraim, who was like a mighty ox, and so their flag was an ox. And so you got a lion, an ox. Revelation calls it a calf, but a lion and a calf. Calf is a cow, an oxen. And then you had the tribe of Dan was one of the other leaders, and their flag, based on their prophecy, was that they would be like a flying eagle. Some translations translate their thing as a serpent, but it is but it is also referencing an eagle, and so they took the eagle version of that prophecy as their flag, which kind of ended up being prophetic because they were the tribe that got up and flew away and left the promised land. The tribe of Dan did, because they were supposed to be where the Philistines were in Gath and all those places that were where the main heart of the Philistine kings were. That was the tribe of Dan, and they never took it. And so that's why Samson is living in the midst of the Philistines when he's doing his stuff with Delilah and everything. And so eventually then they just left. And where they ended up settling was north, actually out of the promised land. And so in Revelation, when he gives the list of the 12 tribes, Dan is not mentioned because they, like a bird, like an eagle, they took off and flew. But anyway, so their flag was the eagle. And then the fourth leader was Reuben, and he was the firstborn. And so because he was the firstborn son, they had on their flag the picture of a man's face. Right. So the four lead tribes were the lion, the eagle, the ox, and the man's face. Right. And they were all around the tabernacle, which had the Ark of the Covenant, which was the throne of the Lord. So when you hear this vision, now let's read it again. Around the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were four living creatures, full of eyes in front and back. Normally in prophecy, if you see something that's covered in eyes, it means it's symbolic for a massive group of people. Right? That's why there's eyes all over it, because it's not about the creature. It's talking about a group of people. So when it says, I saw this lion, this angel with a lion, and it had eyes everywhere, it is probably symbolic of the tribe of Judah. So anyways, but it says, in the midst of the throne, around the throne, were four living creatures full of eyes in front and back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf, which is cow or an oxen. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like an eagle. So, that first section, it could be that God had them set up their camp in Israel to reflect real heavenly living creature, like in some kind of angelic, unique living creature that is actually in heaven. And he had Israel copy their camp off of that, because there is no doubt that is the picture here. The four living creatures around the throne. It is the camp of Israel in the wilderness. But what is harder to tell is there a real living creature like that in heaven, and God had them do their camp because it is a reflection of something that's actually in heaven? Or is this vision that John sees, and this is kind of what I think it probably is, the vision that John is seeing is symbolic. It's a vision, right? It says, he's seeing this vision. And God is giving him this picture of these living creatures because anyone in Israel would know that the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle, that's the tribe of Israel, And so anyways, so that is his picture here as he's seeing this. And what we're going to get to, probably we'll do another video to kind of go through with this. This is going to lead us then into Revelation 5. And that's where we're going to pick up with the seals in the next video, is that he's now seeing this throne room vision, but who's going to fulfill it? And this 4 living creatures in the throne of God, that goes all the way back to the wilderness picture. And what did they receive in the wilderness? The covenant, right? That you have to live this perfect life to be blessed. And throughout all of history, none of them were ever able to do it. So he's seeing this vision of the throne, and around it are these 4 living creatures. And that brings me all the way back to Exodus, when they got the 10 Commandments, and they got the law, and they agreed to fulfill the law. But from that time forward, no one was ever able to fulfill the covenant. No one was ever able to do what the law required of them. And so no one was ever able to fulfill the covenant. And so that leads us into Revelation chapter 5, where he says, I see this scroll, but no one's been worthy to open it. And then they said, finally, the lion and the lamb, the Messiah, is finally able to open it. What did the Messiah do that none of the rest of them, from the time that the throne was set up in the wilderness with the 4 living creatures, the 4 groups of Israel all around it, what was no one but the Messiah able to do from then? Fulfill the covenant. He's the only one. He said, I didn't come to destroy the covenant. I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it. And so I think that is the setup of Revelation chapter 5 that we are seeing when it says there's nobody there that could open the seals. I think it's saying that there was no one who was able to fulfill the covenant, and no one was found worthy. Everyone had sinned. The Messiah was the only one. From the time that Israel agreed to obey all of God's laws till the time that Jesus comes, no one was found worthy. And I think that's what the message of Revelation 4 and 5 is that now the Messiah has come and he is worthy, right? Because keep in mind, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so he is now the one that's worthy to open up the seals, to open up the power of the covenant, if you will. And so all this begins to unfold. But that is the core thought, right? Is that from the time back in the wilderness till now, no one was worthy, but here comes the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he was found worthy. And so then from Revelations 5 on, we begin to see what happens now that Jesus has been found worthy, and he has the authority to then open up the scroll, right? Okay.